Okay. Well, thanks so much for having me. As already been said, I'm dialing in from the Middle East right now, so it's like 7 p.m. here, and excuse the background noise. But besides that, it looks like I've got a stable connection. Um, Good to meet you all. I hope you all have a lot of fun in Atlanta. My name is Lennart Heim. I work for Rand. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I work on all things AI governance, basically. That's what I spent my day working on. Rand is a big think tank. Rand does a bunch of things. Most famously, it does have a bunch of contracts with government and helps government to make more objective, informed decisions about all types of policy. And for my case, this is AI policy. The paper which I'm going to be talking about came out in February, but basically summarizes a bunch of my work over the last 2 years. Notably, I don't speak on behalf of Rand. I don't speak on behalf of GovAI. This is Lennart Heim speaking on my personal behalf here. And again, the paper I'm presenting here and also the slide background you see is GovAI inspired. So this has nothing to do with Rand. What I want to do, what I've been asked to do, is briefly talk about this paper. This paper is pretty long, and I only got like 10 to 15 minutes. So I will just give a brief overview of like let's say the theoretical and empirical argument why one could use compute for governing AI, not necessarily if one should. So basically, I'll just talk about the opportunities and possibilities, how it can be used, and then I will give some examples because more importantly, and I think this is part of the discussion here, it's not about should it be used. It's being used right now as a governance tool for AI, and I think this is a particularly interesting discussion here. So I'll briefly talk about the promise of compute. Then we'll talk about the governance capacities it enables, and then I will end with some examples of it being used in, well, notably US, EU policy, and yeah, security policy all around the world. You can find the paper under, again, just Googling the term, you will find it, but there's also like a short link here. The short term is CPGAI. And there's also a shorter blog post on the GovAI blog, which summarizes the paper, but also within the paper, we got an introduction which summarizes this paper. So we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. So like there's the 2-page summary, there's the 5-page summary, and there's also the 100-page version if you're really dedicated. And if you're super lazy, again, I will give you the 10-minute version, or you just scroll through the paper. We put in a lot of effort into the figures. So the argument which I'm making here is basically, well, we produce these AI systems. You probably talked about if they should be governed or not be governed, if there are any risks at all. I'm not going to go into the details here. I'm first going to talk about like how are these systems, AI systems being produced. And there's like one way which Ben Buchanan put forward from CSTAT, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, also in DC, which is the AI train, right? We train these systems on a bunch of data. We have these algorithms, these architectures, which use this data. And all of this is happening on big supercomputers. And out of this, we get AI development, AI systems. And I think one naive way to just basically going about AI governance is like you pick one of these inputs and you basically try to use it as a governance node. And again, yeah, trying to govern AI development, but also AI deployment. The first argument which I make is argument A, like it's feasible to govern compute. What do I mean with compute? With compute, I mainly pointed to AI accelerators, enterprise AI accelerators. You might know it by the terms NVIDIA H100, A100, V100, but also, I mean, pick your favorite company, AMD here and others. So I'm pointing to the computational infrastructure being used for this, the physical product. So the first argument is compute is rivalrous and excludable. If you're an economist, you've probably heard these terms. Rivalrous means, in this case, if I'm crunching numbers on your computer with a full capacity, nobody else can be crunching numbers on your computer. Excludable means here, I can exclude you from getting this good. Right? I can simply not sell compute to you. If I'm like a cloud provider, I can simply kick you off out of my infrastructure. The other argument here is the quantifiability of compute. In contrast to the other inputs, it's like I have an easier way of counting it. So like an NVIDIA H100 has a certain processing performance. It can crunch that many numbers at this position at a single point in time. And I can also just like add up these numbers, right? Like if I've run an accelerator for that many hours, I know how many numbers it crunched. This is a useful feature in general for policy, because, I mean, unfortunately or fortunately, we a lot of times need to put numbers on things, and this is where it helps. And then the last argument is where I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. It's just like practically, it's just feasible to control who gets access to compute. And this is largely enabled by the supply chain concentration, how the semiconductor supply chain is being built nowadays. Some of you might have heard about the book Chip Wars from Chris Miller, and the chip wars are going on, right? It's being used as a governance node right now, which, again, impacts AI, but also broader development beyond AI. To give an intuition here, I generally like to say like AI chips, the chips in your smartphone, but also particularly AI chips, they cost you like 30,000 for a single chip. They're like probably one of the most complex products we as humanity have ever built, right? This is like us coming together like over the last 80 years, trying to build smaller and smaller transistors. And I mean, if any of you, even if you get all of your friends together and put in a lot of effort, and you want to build these things in your garage, I think you probably won't be successful. So what you see on these pictures is like the extreme ultraviolet photography machine for ASML, which is like mostly being used for producing like these cutting edge chips below 5 nanometers. To get like a more holistic vision of this is I think it's like always good to look at the compute supply chain, but even here this chart goes a little bit more beyond. I call it the AI compute supply chain. Again, when we talk about chips, we have somebody designing these chips. This is your Google with their TPU. This is your NVIDIA, right? One of the most valuable companies in the world nowadays. They design a chip. These chips are then getting fabricated. You might have heard about TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company, mostly sitting in Taiwan, but also right now building in Arizona, which then producing these chips. But TSMC requires these machines, which you've seen on the previous slides, coming from ASML, which has 100% market share there, and they all come out of the Netherlands. And out of this, we get an AI chip, right? But it doesn't end there, because if you're an AI developer nowadays, if you open AI or even in your academia, generally the chip is sitting in your office, usually these chips sitting in big data centers, industrial grade, big facilities, right? So we go beyond there where we have the compute provision angle, where people take these chips and then they sell you often an H100, a GPU hour, right? So we have these data centers, and I think nowadays you see more and more people talking about data centers, partially because of the ever increasing energy demands here. And it's become, I would say, partially a new unit of governance and like a big topic in this year. And then later, and then maybe interestingly enough here, we have like these companies building these data centers, and then we have AI companies using these data centers for training AI systems. But we often see these are one and the same company, right? I already talked about Google. Google designs chips, they don't manufacture them, but then they go into their data centers, they train their own AI systems. So we have like often described as vertical integration, seen here in this chart as a horizontal integration of all of these, again, companies coming together. And all of this is to say is like, I think it's generally like just a good intuition pump to walk through the supply chain and like trying to understand this. And again, all of these nodes help you to intervene potentially on AI development. So to summarize, I now try to make the argument like, man, this computational infrastructure, another way of saying this, like who gets an NVIDIA H100? Who gets 10,000 of them is a thing which the government can control potentially if it wanted to, and if it should to. The US government is doing so right now due to these features which I've just been talking about. There's no question here, what does this has to do with AI? And this goes back to one of my earlier work. I'm still affiliated with the research organization Epoch, which does a lot of empirical research. We do the boring stuff. We read like these 200 papers and like figure out what are the macro trends in machine learning. And what you see in this chart here is one of the first papers we wrote about compute trends, where we basically looked at like these AI systems that require a certain amount of computational operations to be trained, right? Like again, we have an architecture, it has that many billions of parameters. These billions of parameters are getting trained on these trillions of tokens. And for this, you need to crunch these numbers, right? And what we've seen historically, we see like nicely in the pre-deep learning area, like before 2010, 2012, the trend, again, not a lot of samples here, roughly follows a doubling every 24 months. It's equivalent with Moore's law. Another way of saying this is we did not throw more money at the problem. We mostly just got better computers over time, got more compute, and then did throw it at these systems. But the deep learning area changed this, right? We went for these bigger systems, throwing more data at this. And since then, and the trend is still continuing as of right now, even though I think I don't have most of the up-to-date data there, but you can find it online on epochai.org. You see the training compute for these systems is doubling every 6 months. Right. And this is notable because compute does not get cheaper every 6 months. This basically means over the last decade, we've just been throwing more and more money on more and more chips, building more and more bigger data centers. And I'm still surprised to that extent this has been like roughly holding true. So again, we see like training compute doubles every 6 months. That's a pretty steep exponential. This cannot go on forever. Again, we might see right now that we cannot secure the energy, we cannot build data centers big enough, or we simply don't want to spend the money because maybe it's not going to bring the return we want, right? Like these training runs nowadays cost hundreds of millions. And if we will make that much money out of these systems is probably still to be determined. And again, this is just a trend, just for this deep learning area. We've been seeing these systems using more and more. Like, just as an example, if you look at like systems like GPT-4, we talk about thousands of chips. I think nowadays the clusters which are being built, famously, Elon Musk now built a cluster with 100,000 H100s trying to train. I mean, I think probably already trained partially on his cluster. The Grok system will continue training the system. So And they're not doing this because they all like to waste money. It's basically, we've seen these systems lead to better performance. And again, there's a little bit of out of scope here, but I think it's an important part of the discussion here. And I only make a superficial argument here, which is like, well, they throw more compute at these systems because it leads to better performance. So we've seen empirically more compute, more training compute, bigger systems lead to bigger performance, right? This claim needs to be more investigated. And there's like a bunch of nuance to it. I think the general point roughly still holds, right? It's nowadays the case that like you need these millions to train these big systems when we talk about large language models or what people call frontier AI systems. So putting both of these arguments together, you can govern compute, you can say where compute goes. The US right now can basically say, dear PRC, no AI chips for you. And part of the reasons this will have an impact on AI capabilities because they will use less chips, they will use worse chips. This means they can only train smaller systems, and these smaller systems potentially have less performance, or at least they can deploy less systems because they have less total number of AI chips in their country. And notably, like another feature of this computer is like the dictatability feature here, right? We talk about big data centers here, which you can literally see from space. Cool. That's brief argument for compute. Happy to go into more details later. What can we now do with this? We can get visibility. I was already talking about it. The AI governance problems to some degree is easier because I'm not worried about any one of you guys building a big, large language model, which is as powerful as the other ones in your basement, because I simply don't think you have millions in your bank account. Please don't take this personal. Yes, to train these systems, right? So like knowing who has a bunch of access to compute is potentially has an easier way to like participate at the frontier. And to some degree, I think XAI is a good example of this. Like pretty new team, bought a bunch of GPUs, have a bunch of money from Elon Musk, get NVIDIA GPUs because NVIDIA, you know, they like to give GPUs to people who don't design their own systems. And then they can just train a system, which is at least performing to some benchmarks fairly well and is at the frontier. So we know who has access to compute can potentially participate there. Secondly, we can talk about allocation. Who has access to compute? Like we can decide who has access to compute as the government, for example, could do so. An example of this, where I will later have a slide on, is the National AI Research Resource in the US, but also in the UK and any other government, and in the EU, Euro HPC, they want to build more supercomputers to give it to their researchers. So they can allocate it where they say like, dear researchers, you don't have enough compute. Big tech is taking over all of this. We should give you some access so you can build more fair, better models, or we think you should explore this more. Again, academia works different. So they can basically try to address a market failure here by giving it more compute, but they can also try to take compute away from actors which they think are irresponsible. And lastly, it can be used for enforcement. An example of this is export controls, which the US is currently doing, where the leading AI chips are not allowed to go to the PRC. And it's basically a way of enforcing. It's like, guys, we had these end user and use controls. They didn't really work because we have the civil military fusion going on here. So we just like cut off the access completely. And this is one way for us enforcing that you, again, don't participate in AI. Another way of enforcing this is, which cloud providers nowadays are already doing. If I go to a cloud provider and I train an AI system, let's just say I train it on deepfakes and I create like non-consensual porn or these kinds of things, cloud providers right now could cut me off by simply denying me the access for the compute for training such a system or deploying such a system. If I would assume I would, again, give such a service to others. I will end with 3 examples to give a little bit more empirical backing of all the things which I've been talking about here, because it's a nice academic discussion here, but these things are happening on the ground right now. And I think it's fair to say there has not been a lot of literature on it. And I think this comes at a cost, potentially. We need more investigations on these kinds of things, and we need them quicker because government and others are acting quickly on AI. And if they should do so, I think this is partially what the audience, all these people attending the workshop should be trying to address. Already talked about it. We have the US semiconductor export controls since October 2022. This came before ChatGPT. I think many were not aware of this. Again, this is a broader policy. AI is clearly part of the goal of US government here. They talk in the updated statement from 2023, and I expect we will see more talk about this in the National Security Memorandum, which is coming out any week, soonish. It's definitely before the end of the year, potentially before the election. That cutting off China's access to compute, part of the motivation is for them to not train frontier AI systems. Second example of this is the US executive order. The US executive order has, in my opinion, a pretty good rule, which is so-called reporting under the Defense Production Act, where they say, you guys, you train these big systems, can you give us a heads up and run some evaluations and like just give us a little bit of information here? I wouldn't call it regulation because it's just an executive order, can be revoked any time. And I also not call it regulation because all it asks for is for information sharing. I do think information sharing is pretty critical. I want to give the government more access to information so they can make better informed decisions, and this policy helps there. And compute is being used, not necessarily as the physical product, but as a training compute idea, where we basically say, well, these bigger systems are potentially more dangerous. And if you're above this threshold, you need to report it. You see that's the red line in this chart here, which basically means at the point when this rule was passed, no system passed this threshold. Maybe nowadays systems have passed this threshold. We don't know as of right now. Another example of this is the AI Act, where a system is assumed to have systemic risk, where general purpose AI system is assumed to have systemic risk if it's trained with more than 10 to the power of 25 operations. The last example I will close with, which might be relevant to this audience, depending where you're at, is we've done some work on the so-called compute divide. What you see in both of these charts is we took a look at all of these systems, AI systems, what we call notable AI systems. We were looking from where they're coming from. Are they coming out of industry and academia? And what we've just seen over time is, then again, academia was leading in machine learning, leading in producing a system. But since, again, compute has become this currency, it's been harder and harder for academia to just participate in this, right? Because you need millions, you need the infrastructure, you need the engineers to eventually train the system. So we see this compute divide between academia and industry, but also notably, we see a compute divide also between countries, right? There's like certain countries where it's like way more access to public high performance infrastructure, and certain countries who have like way more cloud providers available to them. Again, so it also goes back to funding. How much money can the research institute throw at training these systems? Let me wrap it up. I made the argument it's feasible to govern compute. We already see it right now. It might be effective, at least you don't have access to more compute, and it will be harder for you to deploy more. And it might even be valuable, depending on what your goal is, but it's clearly alone not sufficient. It's always part of a broader ecosystem, right? I think it's sometimes mistaken that people just think they can wield this blunt tool and this solves AI governance. Again, all of the, let's just call it normal AI governance around it is still applicable, right? We're still in the UAI Act, we still have evaluations, we still need to take a closer look at these models. It'd be mistaken to purely assume, just because you assume the threshold based on one number, that you're like a really dangerous systems, but at least it gives us like a quick initial filter. Secondly, we have these capabilities which I talked about. We can get visibility, we can allocate compute, and we can use it for enforcement. I think all of these capabilities are being used right now already by the government. If they're being used wisely is another question. And then lastly, as I was just saying, we're using it already. We got national AI compute projects in there. The Brits wanted to throw 1 billion at compute. We got Euro HPC. We're using training compute thresholds in the US EO and EU AI Act, and we got existing export controls. So this is topic left the academic realm. It's being used in Brussels, DC, pick your favorite government. They're potentially making use of this. We have more. Last point, more research and more scrutiny, please. It sometimes feels a bit lonely being a technical person in DC. And I would appreciate like more discussions about existing policies, particularly on export controls and how they might impact AI development more. And I think, unfortunately, there's not a lot of scholarly treatment on these types of policies. And I think more would definitely be warranted. Cool. I will close it right now here. And sorry for rushing through this. I just want to make sure I cover all of this. But if you want to go deeper, again, happy to share the links. Maybe this would have been shared with you before. And take a closer look. And you can always reach out to me via email. Thanks so much.
Right. So just to set some context, I think the last 2 years have seen like a surge in activity around this concept of AI safety. It's inspired, I think, a lot of different policy solutions and proposals, along with corporate governance solutions and proposals. We've seen the development of AI safety institutes, which are now taking a very model evaluation focused concept of safety, where you assess foundation models or frontier models for different kinds of risks. We're seeing as well kind of a surge in voluntary commitments for foundation model developers from the G7, the US Executive Order in the United Kingdom, trying to make commitments for testing, evaluations, and other kinds of requirements on foundation model developers. We're seeing the development of new regulatory requirements in some cases. They're trying to formalize those voluntary commitments into some kind of binding standard that these companies must adopt. The EU codes of practice right now for general purpose AI systems is one. We're expecting a UK AI bill for frontier models in the next week or two, which is likely going to apply some kind of critical risk threshold or duty of care for these companies. And we're also seeing, again, kind of corporate responsibility practices that are developing. I hate the term responsible scaling policies, but that's a thing now, which we must all deal with. And really what these are calling for essentially are a set of practices and commitments for every company to think about how they are releasing systems, how they are testing their models, crucially, not what they are sharing about their training data sets for some strange reason, but really trying to get them in this mindset of an obligation of kind of voluntary practices they sign up to. This is really treating, I think, this kind of regime, treating safety as a model property. And for anyone who's read Arvind Aranyan and Sash Kapoor's excellent book, AI Snake Oil, they have an entire section about how safety isn't a model property. It's not something we can really apply to that. So I really want to kind of dig into a bit of how we can think about expanding on this concept of safety, what that means, and how we can think of these things like compute interventions, data interventions, model interventions as one part of a wider scheme. To do that, I think it's helpful to start with what we think of the value chain behind these kinds of technologies. This is our very simplistic graphic. Please don't tear me apart for this. It's our attempt at trying to explain all the different kinds of actors that might be involved in the creation of a foundation model system. And I really want to stress that for any kind of AI system, you'll have some kind of different actors or different roles behind that system. Those might be the same entity, might be completely different entities. A value chain might change from over time as a product develops or is rolled out to new markets. It's not a sort of static dynamic thing. But what is consistent is these different roles and activities that are kind of behind this type of approach, something that Milton touched on in his introductory remarks. You can see that at the top here we have sort of a data layer, where are your data sources coming from for training? How are you cleaning and annotating that data? What kinds of companies are offering that service? As Lennart just noted, you have compute providers kind of in different stages, thinking about data center development, the kinds of software to run your systems for training. You have a foundation model developer layer or an AI developer layer. That has many stages, from cleaning and retraining a model to fine tuning it, adding safeguards, internal testing. You have hosting providers. These are your GitHubs, your Civets, your Hugging Faces that make models widely available. It could also be API services like Google Cloud are kind of offering these through an API system. You have an application layer, those who are building on the systems or kind of building wrappers around GPT-4 to sell as a downstream product. You have application users, people actually using it and engaging with the system. And crucially, you have this other group, affected users, people who might not be using the system, but could nonetheless be affected by decisions or activities that are made by it. You think, for example, someone who's the victim of non-consensual sexual imagery, they have never used the system, but they're still nonetheless affected by it and are part of the system. You have to think about them. We talk about the kinds of obligations, responsibilities, modes of redress, for example, that someone might need. So right now, most of the conversation around safety is just focused in this level. It's just focused on foundation model evaluations and evaluation-focused regimes. That's the state of the UK AI Safety Institute's approach, the state of the US Safety Institute's approach. It's kind of a very limited approach because it's a lot of evaluations focusing on this question of capabilities of a system. Now, when we think about the kinds of risks that arise from any kind of system, it's not like risks originate and crucially proliferate at any given stage. They're going to arise at all different parts of that stage. Take bias, for example. Bias issues might arise in your training data sets. They might arise in the way that you're fine tuning that data. They might arise in the model architecture that you use. It might arise in how a system is being used by downstream users because it's being used for discriminatory purposes. A good example is one study that our colleagues at Data Society did found that quite a number of providers of automated CV screening tools are using ChatGPT to survey and scan CVs. It's not built for that purpose, but nonetheless it's being used to discriminate against certain individuals on that basis. So when we think about these kinds of testing and evaluation regimes, when we talk about safety, we have to think about all those different actors in the supply chain and the kinds of obligations that might exist in each. Now, we've done some work with looking at model evaluation, sort of the limitations of this practice. We did a project earlier this year that surveyed about 25 different individuals who are either working in frontier model development firms doing evaluations, or who are working for third-party organizations who are offering them as a service. And I think everyone agrees in the model evaluation space that these are just very broken at the moment and a very emerging science. They're something that's in very early stages and have huge issues behind them. Some of those are around external validity. So one huge issue is just that many evaluations just don't map to real world scenarios and harms. There's also a very limited involvement of affected communities. It's usually, when you do have any kind of engagement through red teaming, it's kind of through self-selected experts that are usually defined by the provider. That might work very well when you talk about biosecurity, biorisks, but not so much if you're trying to understand potential labor impacts of these technologies in different sectors or regions. There's also a huge issue of evaluating general purpose models across different use cases. For example, many evaluations are just focused on text modality. There's a huge gap in any kind of evaluation for video generation, image generation, audio generation. Also huge issues here as well around contamination of evaluation data sets. Many evaluations that you might have seen, including things like SAT scores or the loss LSAT, are kind of meaningless when you talk to people who are doing these evaluations, because it's almost a sure thing that that information, those answers, are buried within the training data somewhere. Even some of the recent benchmarks that the brilliant team at Stanford have been putting out, they find that there's contamination in certain models almost a matter of months after those are being released. So it's a huge issue about making sure these are valid. They're also brittle. Evaluations can change based on prompt sensitivity. So, what kind of prompt are you inputting? But also, they really don't work very well when you make fine tweaks or changes to a model. One individual we spoke with at a company that will remain nameless described how their evaluations of a certain model really tells very little about the safety or performance of that evaluation on a fine-tuned model, even on innocuous training data. So it really means that, what are we learning when we do these evaluations? Really what it tells us is if something is unsafe or might be unsafe, but not a guarantee or sort of an understanding of if it will be in all variations of its use. I think this is really important because a lot of these evaluations look at capabilities. And I think that word is important for us to just focus on a minute of what's meant by capabilities. Lee Sharkey at Apollo Research has done a really brilliant paper that kind of explores this concept, and he breaks it into parts. You think about contextual capabilities of system. So how is it performing and what kinds of behaviors does it have in a particular context? For example, a mental health chatbot that's being provided to someone for diagnostic purposes. You can think of absolute capabilities. What's this kind of like high-end ceiling of what we can get it to do under any circumstance? And you can think as well about the propensity of those capabilities. How often is it achieving that certain task or action? This term, I think, is being really misunderstood because it removes us away from this understanding of capabilities in context, what a system is doing when it's being deployed into the messy environments with all kinds of human interactions, and trying to assign a capability to a model in the abstract. That just doesn't really work. So I think one challenge here is when we think about safety, and Heidi Cloth has written extensively in this about really challenging this conception of how we're defining safety. Heidi comes from a systems engineering background. She's written this really brilliant paper for Trail of Bits, which is essentially just kind of pointing out that when we talk about system safety, and even product safety for that matter, it's preventing a system from impacting its environments in an undesirable or harmful way. And safety tries to understand all the characteristics of that product, how it's marketed, its design, its end users, the effect it might have on other products likely to be used with. Another kind of related term here is efficacy. This is this idea of ensuring the system has the desired impact that it has. It's oftentimes misconstrued with alignment, which is more of a sort of goal of trying to have a system behave with user intentions, but not a confirmation that it actually is doing so. So that definition, I think, is important because it moves us into this idea of really what we talk about when we talk about a goal of safety is something around socio-technical safety. A comprehensive approach of ensuring the safe development and deployment and operation of AI systems that recognizes that AI is not just a technical challenge, but one that involves complex interactions between technological components and human, organizational, and societal factors. That term socio-technical is a really interesting one. It comes from the 1950s from a group of British organizational management researchers who were studying coal mines. And the question they were brought in to ask or answer was, why is it that this new attempt or way of developing coal mines that removes kind of small teams that are working start of the day to end of the day in sort of small spaces into what was called a long shaft form of mining, where you have kind of a massive wedge into the earth with kind of rotating people coming in and out? Why is this new advancement in mining technology, which seems by all accounts to improve productivity and efficiency, causing our workers to have such a bad blowback? Why is our productivity dropping? And what they came up with was this idea that when they were introducing this new technology, it was fundamentally changing the social interactions that miners had in this new environment. They were finding that they no longer were working with people they knew and trusted. They were no longer sort of seeing all parts of the production cycle. They were suddenly finding themselves not trusting the other people coming in after them to finish the part of the job, and it was destroying and breaking down productivity. And they coined this idea of socio-technical to describe this idea that it's not that you have social interactions around technology and technological aspects of a technology. Those are intertwined concepts. It's not social or technical, it is social technical, a single thing. So when we talk about social technical, what does that mean? I mean, I think it really focuses this idea of every components of a system and how that can tell us something about its safety or its potential impacts. It could be, this is from Chris Clegg, no relation to Nick, who has written a lot about this idea of how you can break up and think about the components of any kind of technological system. You think about the people, the technology, the infrastructure, the processes, the goals, the culture behind the use of technology in its context. And if you think, use a real example, this is from an actual case study looking at why a particular hospital in Mid-Staffordshire in 2005, 2009, why it had such a colossal breakdown in its ability to serve care to all different kinds of individuals in its region. It was due to a number of technological, infrastructural, process, culture, and people factors, ranging from a shortage of skilled staff to the failure of tools to monitor, identify quality of care, a general lack of engagement with patients and the public, and a lack of national standards that lack of engagement with national standards for care that individual providers were trying to engage with. Now, this is like a very high standard, I want to say, of like what it means to try to understand a system and apply safety. But, you know, it's not like we don't have examples of this in the technological space. There's countless case studies of this use of ethnographic approaches and STS approaches to try to understand what makes systems safe or unsafe in its environment. And it goes beyond just an evaluation of a model or an AI system. This is an example that the team at Data Society worked on along with Duke University Hospital that studied their sepsis watch system. And it was an evaluation of a tool that was trying to detect within a hospital which patients might be at risk of slipping into sepsis infection. Sepsis is the #1 killer in hospitals. Once you get an infection, you have literally hours to respond, or a patient might be in severe distress. And what they wanted to test out was they had a system that was incredibly accurate at using diagnostics to predict if someone was going to be at risk. But what they couldn't figure out was why it wasn't working in their hospital. And it wasn't until they brought in nurses, hospital admin staff, doctors, and really talked to them about how would you find this tool working for your needs? How sensitive do you need this detection system to be? Who on the hospital floor needs to be alerted to get to a particular place in the hospital to respond in time? It was not until then that you suddenly started to see this tool have enormous improvements in sepsis detection and improvements in reduction in the death rate for people in this hospital. So it is something that we do. It does require, I think, a very different approach to safety than what we're taking now. It's much more holistic. It means considering the design, development, integration, and culture environmental factors, and crucially, how humans interact with these systems. It's a much more grounded and empirical method of safety and evaluation. So it follows on model evaluations with surveys, focus groups, in the extreme case, RCTs or randomized control trials, but it can also include things like pilots, which again, is happening in governments. UK, at least, we are piloting these tech tests and systems, which is not doing so in a way that can join up with model evaluations. It does require interdisciplinary expertise, continuous assessment to come back to these systems, the stakeholder engagement that involves relevant stakeholders across the particular system. My pitch here would just be to say that as we start to talk about governance and applications and how you can improve this kind of model-focused approach to governance, this is the direction we should be heading in. It's not an either or, it's a yes and. And there, thank you so much.
When I think about model or compute-based governance, I think there's like a couple of assumptions that are embedded in these things that we kind of need to unpack a little bit. So I don't think Lennart's still here, right?
He is.
Oh, he is? Okay, great. So like, there's a question of, is it an advantage that can be allocated, right? If we govern compute, it can be allocated. Allocated by whom? By the government? The most important thing for the, for AI and for this thing that I think will kind of define the next several decades of economic transformation, we think it's an advantage that can be allocated by the government. I'm not convinced of that claim, to say the very least. In fact, I think that is like an utterly ruinous way to go about governing AI. There's also the assumption embedded that you want that the rest of the world will kind of accept America asserting control over compute. That seems to me to be a quite brittle assumption. I don't really think that the UAE in the long term is interested in that. That's where Lennart is right now. I don't think that China in the long term is interested in that. I don't think Vietnam is. I don't think Namibia is. I don't think anyone is. I don't think that everyone in the rest of the world is going to say, oh, great, the Americans are here to control this thing that is very important. And I don't think we can shove it down the rest of the world's throat, which is the implicit assumption in compute governance. So the kind of last assumption is that America and the West will retain control over these fundamental semiconductor engineering technologies for the rest of time, I guess. And I just don't really, I think that's a quite brittle assumption too. I think, there was a world before the American export controls where the Chinese were kind of stumbling with semiconductor engineering, semiconductor manufacturing. And if you are a China watcher, as I am, and you pay close attention to sort of what goes on inside of the CCP, our export controls of October 2022 were a huge motivating factor for the Chinese. And now it is, the top priority is having an entirely domestic supply chain for compute. Will they get there? Maybe, maybe not. But if they do, it will have been our export controls and our attempt to control compute, which motivated them to do so. And furthermore, there will be a whole crop of new companies that undercut the American and Western companies on price. And by law, our companies will be forbidden to compete in that market. We will not be able to offer products to the Chinese, half the world. For Americans, for American, whatever you want to say, like applied research, right? Like these companies that have sort of oligopolies or monopolies in all these different areas, that goes out the window. So we might well be setting ourselves up for quite dramatic failure in our semiconductor industry in the next 10 years if we go down this route. So I think that we should be very cognizant of that. My expertise is actually more on the software side of things, the kind of model governance. For a long time, I have been saying that I think that compute thresholds are not going to work. They're not going to be a durable mechanism for public policy. Let me tell you what I think compute thresholds can do. I think that when ChatGPT came out and the Biden executive order was drafted and all that, I think the Biden administration had like a fairly simple goal, which was we would like to generally know what the frontier labs are doing, what are they up to? And for that kind of transitory contingent goal, I think compute thresholds are fine, right? 10 to the 26 flops, it's like, yeah, okay, right now, no one is training with 10 to the 26 flops other than like 4 American companies. So, okay, great. But if you're trying to build a durable governance regime for models, especially one that carries costs with it, which would mean that there's an incentive to be below that threshold, compute thresholds will not work. First of all, it's very hard to pick a good threshold, right? The Europeans chose 10 to the 25 flops, which to describe, there are models now, there are ample models that are over 10 to the 25 flops in training compute. And those models are described by the Europeans as posing a systemic risk to society. And I don't know about you, but I don't really look at like Llama 3 and say like, yes, a systemic risk to society, Llama 3. I don't buy that. And so I think it's very hard to create durable ones. It's also, there are techniques like model distillation that allow you to essentially take outputs from a bigger model and distill them into a much smaller model. We see this happening all the time. GPT-4 came out in March 2023 with 1.8 trillion parameters. There are models that match or exceed its performance now with between 3 and 8 billion parameters. So we're talking about massive cost reductions, massive reductions in the amount of compute. And I heard Andrei Karpathy say the other day that he thinks that the latent intelligence of a large language model can be distilled into something below 1 billion parameters, which would be small enough to run on every laptop in this room. So again, I say, how are we going to control models if that's the case? And there's more complexity too. OpenAI's O1 models, which were released a couple of weeks ago, have a sort of open up a new scaling paradigm in the world of language modeling in the form of test time compute. So these are models that are trained to think rather than just giving you the first tokens that sort of the models predict. These models will take time and they'll think about what they, what the response should be. They'll reflect on their work and kind of backtrack and whatnot. And the performance that these models have is on certain evaluations far better than other frontier language models. But more importantly, the more time you give these models to think, the better their performance is. So if you give them 1 minute, they'll do, they'll have a certain performance on a mathematics examination. If you give them 2, they'll be better. OpenAI envisions a world where we're giving them days or weeks to think on really, really complicated problems like find a cure for cancer, things like that. That's probably an underspecified question, but things like that. And so that means that you have perhaps smaller models that you're running for a longer period of time, and thus exercising control over either the compute or the models themselves in that case would necessitate a global surveillance regime of all of our use of the technology. And this again strikes me as perhaps unwise. So I think that all of these rationalistic attempts to assert control over AI are coming from a place of being genuinely concerned about risks, but ultimately wrong-headed, and ultimately, I think, quite likely to make the risks worse. So what do I think kind of we should be doing instead? Well, a lot of people in the academic world or the startup world who kind of understand these critiques that I've made of model-based governance will say, okay, well, let's regulate the uses, right? I think I saw that on a slide today. Let's regulate the uses of machine learning. Do not tempt our regulators with a good time. Is my advice on that. Because if you say that, what the regulators will say is, well, we're concerned about preemptive regulation. We want to shape, we want to mold this industrial revolution. We want there to be guardrails, right? I am of the belief that history is happening at the moment, major history, right? I think I differ from some people who have presented today in the sense that I do view deep learning as a profound discovery about reality, that you can make matter, you can imbue matter with intelligence if you configure it just so. And I think that's a discovery that will resonate for many decades. And so the idea that the government can kind of preemptively shape the downstream implications of this profound discovery about nature, again, strikes me as really a kind of arrogance and a desire to control the world that I just simply don't think our governments do possess, could possess, or should possess. So how does that look in the US? Use-based regulation, this preemptive use-based regulation. Well, policymakers are going to default towards the most expansive laws that they have to kind of police these things, probably like relying on existing statutes rather than coming up with something de novo. In the United States, the most expansive laws for this kind of thing would probably be our civil rights laws. And indeed, what do you see? You see algorithmic impact assessments being mandated for all sorts of different uses of AI, right? So there's a bill in Colorado that passed. It's not in effect yet, and the governor signed it with strong reservations. This is the weirdest signing statement I've ever seen. The governor was like, I think this is a terrible bill, but I'm signing it anyway, pressured into it. Basically what that bill did is said, if you are an essential service provider or your critical infrastructure, that's about 75% of the American economy is either an essential service or critical infrastructure. So keep that in mind. And you are making a decision which materially impacts or could materially impact the access that a protected group has to your service, and AI could in some way materially impact that. Then you have to do an algorithmic impact assessment, and you could also be you could be exposed to civil rights liability. I think that is absolutely the worst way to regulate AI. I will just say that straight up. I think that is, like, by far, for a technology that is going to transform, I think, much about the structure of business and the structure of organizations and just all of these profound things. I have trouble seeing how it is anything like a good idea to say, well, if that could in some way impact the access. And remember, you don't have to have the intent, in a lot of these things. You don't have to have an intention to discriminate. If there is a disparate impact, you have discriminated, or at least you've discriminated enough that you can be sued by either the government or an individual. So that would essentially be a kind of, do people here know what NEPA is? National Environmental Policy Act? Okay, so this is why, like, if you've ever wondered why it's impossible to build like energy infrastructure, public transit, or like anything in the United States, it's because of this law called NEPA, partially, which is environmental permitting. And basically it gives any environmental group the right to sue if you kind of just like didn't follow some basic process rules, and like it mires any ambitious infrastructure project, and even not so ambitious ones, in years of litigation, essentially inevitably. This is what we would be sleepwalking into if we go with a use-based regime. So I want to sort of emphasize the point that I think Victor made quite well, which is, instead of trying to preemptively shape use, I think what we really want to do is focus on conduct, focus on post hoc enforcement of things that, if people do things that cause social disorder, then it's the government's job to arrest that activity. But it is not the government's job to preemptively shape an industrial revolution. And I'm not quite sure where any of us got off on the idea that is the case, but I think it's a deep sickness of the 21st century that we believe that. And so that is my spiel.
So yeah, I have the very easy job of moderating the session. My plan was actually to ask a kind of broad question that's been on my mind and that relates to the three presentations given, and to get comments from the three presenters. I'm not sure if we're going to quite have time for that, but maybe I'll just ask the question and so put it on the table for either the rest of this session or the rest of the day as well. So we started the workshop with the question of, do we need AI governance? And in the first session, we really complicated the notion of AI. It's not just a new unitary technology, but perhaps better thought of as a digital ecosystem with lots of different components. And we've seen some of the different components emphasized in this session. But for me, in answering the question of, do we need AI governance, I also want to know the answer to the question of, well, governance for what? What is it? What kind of outcomes are we trying to achieve through AI governance? What kinds of harms or risks are we particularly concerned to prevent? What kinds of benefits are we particularly concerned to promote? Of course, no new technology or application is going to promote benefits for everyone or reduce risks for everyone. There's also always going to be an unequal distribution of risks and benefits. And so what kinds of distributions are we willing to tolerate, and what kinds do we want to promote, if any? these are all questions on my mind when I'm asking the question of, do we need AI governance? And I guess I haven't heard too much specificity in answering these questions. I mean, I really appreciated the discussion of safety, and I appreciate the idea that safety is not just a property of models. I do worry that there's a whole bunch of contested ethical claims that get sort of I don't know, just assumed in discussions of safety. You know, in the last session, I think it's quite fair to worry that certain regulatory efforts will end up perhaps with risks that we wouldn't otherwise have. I again want to know what kinds of risks are we really prioritizing here. So if I thought Dean, you know, did a really, or sorry, I thought Victor and Dean have done a helpful job in putting questions about sort of decision making on the table and sort of adding that as a potential thing that we might want to be governing for. I again appreciate a lot of the discussion of safety and the issues raised there. But I guess if anyone has comments on really wanting to clarify what it is that we are governing for, that would be sort of helpful for me anyway.
I just would say that we go over 12 noon a little bit, just eating a few minutes into your lunch break. I think it might be worth it to hear some of the discussion.
Happy to share some of the things that keep us up at night in the institutes. And I think one of the ones that is really alarming to us is it's the lack of understanding of what AI systems work, and the coupled with a hype-fueled, desperation-driven desire, particularly in the public sector, to reduce cost efficiencies by integrating AI systems in high-stakes settings. And so what we see a lot is companies who are kind of in a bind, or in some sort of bind. On one hand, they feel enormous pressure to integrate AI systems, for example, replace or augment social work in the UK, or to replace 5,000 civil servants. And yet, because there is no one doing testing and evaluation of simple things around these tools, like how often do they hallucinate when it's a matter of summarizing policy documents in my particular context, they feel a barrier to adoption. So it actually, to your point, Dean, I think some of this is about trying to reduce barriers to adoption, to enable experimentation that works. But we can't just have experimentation, you can't just come up with a hypothesis for an experiment. You have to do the experiment. You have to actually know if things work or not. And right now, we just don't really do that. And the second related thing, I think, is I just see that massively increasing inequalities and hollowing out institutions in the United Kingdom. Again, I cannot stress enough, we have a government, a Labour government, that is absolutely committed to the goal of increasing adoption of AI in our NHS, in our education system, in critical public services, and policing. Not if it works, just adoption with the goal of reducing costs. That is the basis for, I think, why we've had such a de-skilling of so many parts of our services. It's also the basis for, I think, we've had so much loss of trust in critical institutions like the NHS, because people, when we talk to them and do public health service, they want a doctor, they want a healthcare professional, they don't want an app. And as soon as someone sees an application or an AI service is trying to replace or access a barrier to that access to healthcare, it has a cascading effect on institutions. So I'd say that's kind of the big one that we see as something that we really feel is important for safety testing and evaluation.
I wonder though if like is the fact that Western governments are fiscally irresponsible, is that really Sam Altman's fault? I don't know. I just kind of view that's like someone else, that's kind of someone else's.
So he's selling that vision. So he's
yeah, and he should, right? Because it is kind of, I solve for the equilibrium, right? There's not enough money. And so you have to spend less money. And so and AI can help you spend less money. Therefore, I think that there's a certain element to that. But I actually agree with you completely that evaluations are metrology, I think, is measurement, science of measurement, is going to be an extremely important part of AI governance, because I think that these systems within a few years are going to be so fast and doing so much. I ask it to do something and it writes play around with the O1 models. You can watch it, for a minute. In 60 seconds, it'll write 5,000 lines of code. How am I supposed to evaluate 5,000 lines of code? I can't, right? And it's only going to get better from there and more ambitious. And in my mind, it's kind of like we're all, I mean, Sam Altman has said this, right? Like we move up to all being kind of like the CEO of a little mini enterprise of digital agents. And I know you don't like that because I know you don't like the hype, but like, I don't know, I have to tell you, like, the people who have said don't believe the hype have been like pretty consistently incorrect for the last 5 years. And so I'm for the moment, I think it's perfectly fine to sort of believe like, okay, well, maybe these things really could get considerably more capable. And if that's true, it's like, how are we going to keep up? And the way we have to keep up is by designing some sort of mechanism, whether it's a technical mechanism or a socio-technical mechanism. I think it'll probably be both. That like allows us to sort of measure and assess the reliability, the performance, and the sort of veracity of the outputs of these systems. And I think that's like an enormous challenge. It's not obvious to me that that comes from, I think that there will be like private evaluation bodies that will proliferate. And I think trying to figure out this ideal structure in which to allow many evaluation bodies to flourish is probably like a high ROI activity right now. That would be my guess.
Victor and Milton.
So there's 2 points I'd like to make. One is that we need to be careful what we want to measure and evaluate. And we need to be clear what our goal is. What do we want to actually protect? There is oftentimes a tendency to measure what's easy to measure rather than what ought to be measured. And I think we need to have a conversation about what we ought to measure and then think hard about how to measure it. And that gets to my second point, and that is, I think we need to have a debate about what our goals are. And I think Dean and I want to have that debate, even though we are both probably ideologically on opposite ends of the spectrum, but we both agree that it is really important to have that debate because we need to know in which direction we're going. But at the same time, as we develop a better sense in which direction we want to go, we need to also use mechanisms of evaluation to understand whether that is the right direction. And so in a way, the means and the ends are connected because with the mechanisms we can fine-tune the direction in which we are going. And so I think that it would be wrong to say first we have to completely clarify the goals and the direction in which we go before we can even think about the mechanisms. I think we need to develop those in parallel because with mechanisms we can inform our fine-tuning of the direction in which we are going.
Let's have Milton and then Grace and then give Andrew a chance to respond and then we break for lunch.
Right, so I think you asked the perfect question, what are we trying to achieve by AI governance? And I think Andrew's response to that, I really like because it made clear to me that most of the time, maybe all of the time, but at least most of the time, what we're trying to govern are organizational behaviors, right? And the idea that you get leverage on organizational behaviors by regulating a technology is kind of misplaced. So just to give you an example, one of my horrible experiences with AI was if you had when we had Comcast as an internet service provider, and I had some problem that was not a routine problem, and it kept saying, reboot your computer, and I was like, well, sorry, we don't have electrical power. Like, rebooting the computer will not do anything. But I was in a loop. I couldn't get out of it. So it was a terrible implementation. Now, you're not going to have an evaluation agency or a regulatory agency make Comcast do a good job. You might have a utility regulator tell Comcast that they have a public complaint mechanism for, but it's what you're complaining about is the organizational behavior rather than the technology or even the implementation of the technology. And that gets to Leonard Heim's paper. So again, when you're regulating compute, well, he made a statement that bigger systems are more dangerous. And so like, what is this danger? We'll be talking about that in the next session, but I mean, it's like, is that really a linear relationship, Leonard, between danger and the computing power, right? Does it necessarily bring about more danger, or are we concerned about, you know, somebody creating a lethal autonomous weapon system, in which case we want to somehow control nation state behavior, not necessarily compute power?
I guess I want to come back to the point about private evaluations in this market for private evaluations, because I'm a big fan of the idea of adaptive policy, but I think essentially I've never really seen it implemented practically. You know, you study this in grad school and public policy programs, you're like, wow, this would be so cool. You implement a policy for a couple of years, you evaluate it, you measure it, and then you change the policy, and that never really happens in practice. And it's very hard even in government to get to a place where you can take sort of adaptive steps or baby steps or try to adjust, et cetera. And I think to some extent, this is what Lennart said at the beginning, but I do think that he's right, that the sort of goal in the executive order was, you know, we had a 1-year shot clock that basically kicked off in October of 22 until the time we published the executive order in October of 23, where essentially the question of all agencies, you know, send the White House like things we can do on AI ASAP. And there wasn't a ton of time to think about how you can, you know, we're in a period of uncertainty. So how do you do that well? And so the 10 to the 26 and the sort of this idea that we would have a threshold and we would look for information, these were all kind of approximations. And you said this in your talk too, like they were approximations because we were trying to get something until we had a better sense, more certainty, more evaluation, more measurement. I don't know, however, that, you know, and I don't know what to do about whether we believe the hype or don't believe the hype. There's testimony that was a couple of months ago, or no, a month ago on the Hill, someone testified and said essentially the West Coast folks believe that AGI is in the, you know, next decade problem, and we'll talk about this in the next session, I think, and then folks on the East Coast in the policy space who are skeptical of that claim. And unfortunately, like you've got that disjointedness, but you've got the folks on the East Coast making much of the policy, right? So what do you do in that space? There was this discussion here about whether or not we would build up this market for private evaluation, and I would love for that to be the case. I just don't think that that's ever really come through or happened. Because I was also inside a company and had the same challenges where internally you try to execute control. Companies hate that. They hate their employees who are doing internal audits or assessments. And then they also hate paying for external companies to do that because they can't even control the outcome in those cases. And then in a few cases, I've worked on sort of impact assessments or evaluations or things like that that are done for local governments. And ultimately, I'll just say local governments hate it too. And in most of the cases that I've worked on those, they don't publish the documents. They claim them as drafts and they don't release them under FOIA. So I don't know where we're going to get that market for private evaluation. I would love for that to be the case. The only other way to do it is to do public evaluation, perhaps. But then you're in this environment where in an era of uncertainty, you don't know how to do that. And I don't know what the outcome is. All of these things are expensive, right? If you're looking just at cost.
It all exists already, right? I mean, like we privately evaluate, a lot of the software that you use on a daily basis is privately evaluated before it's deployed.
Not
By an
for-
FDA for software called Apple. And ironically, our government hates it. Our government absolutely hates it. Like, we should have an FDA for software, and Apple's like, here's an FDA for software. Everyone's like, screw you. There's an incoherence to the way that policy.
Big lifty, I mean, she's talking about a lot higher thing than apps on an app store.
I understand that, but I'm saying that like a lot of private governance already, like there is a lot of private governance that takes place, right?
I guess
But
then
to
the
your
question goes
questions
to
of
that
scale.
organizational behavior thing, whereas like the private governance exists for performance for, you know, whatever standards, like Apple has certain standards for privacy or security, and they're evaluating systems based on those standards, which we may agree with.
Yeah.
You're right, but they're different than social impact, you know, whether or not that system is gonna provide someone with the medical care that they need, or it's gonna prevent a national security disaster, right? That's what the government, that's why thinking about the largest systems having the most impact is a very quick approximation, but it is an approximation that somewhat makes sense, because if a large system that's deployed across the board does something badly, then it impacts more people than a smaller system. It's not a perfect approximation, it's just an
No, for sure, I
approximation.
agree with that.
I just don't know how to change that. I think the understanding in the executive order was that we would eventually, that 10 to the 26 was not going to last.
Yeah.
And
But the question is when and how and all those other pieces.
Can I just, does Lennart want to comment? Because I realize that you not have a chance to read, so I can respond. See,
If
he's
still
still
on.
to respond.
Leonard,
here we go.
hey there.
Hey folks, I'm still around. It's getting more noisy here. Correct me. Was there a question? Is there something in particular I should comment on?
It works now.
Wow. What is the way?
Just wanted to give you the chance to jump in if you wanted.
I mean, many good things have been said, many points to respond to. I think, is there anything which in particular stands out? I think there's this broader question here, which I think sometimes gets confused when like people think we should really talk about which AI risks, which AI governance are we talking about here, right? We talked about the compute thresholds, we talked about the executive order, we talked about the UAI Act. All of these have different goals, right? The UAI Act is how many hundreds of pages? And again, some of these pages are dedicated to general purpose AI systems, right? Where they talk about certain systemic risk. Again, we've got another couple of pages dedicated to being AI being used in medical devices, AI being used for surveillance, this even being completely banned. All of these kinds of things. So I think generally for having productive discussions, like really important to disentangle these kinds of things. And then the other point is just like, which regulation do we need? I'm a big fan of the executive order, at least section 4, in that sense that it's trying to get us more visibility here, right? And I think as just already was talked about, this compute threshold is trying to achieve this. But as they know, literally in executive order, it's a preliminary way of going about it. Like this is our first best guess how we can decide these systems. And I think my general take on this is like, I don't know what good AI governance in 2 or 3 years from now looks like. It's a really fast moving field. I'm generally skeptical about anyone claiming they know what best AI regulation looks like. I'm generally just a big fan. Give government more visibility, give government more capacity so they roughly have an idea of what's going on, so they can act swiftly and rapidly in case they see something. But again, as somebody who lives in DC, I think the first thing we just need is more information, more insights for all of these kinds of things. And I think we've been making tremendous progress here. And I think people shouldn't be over worried about over-regulation or anything right now. At least in DC, this is not what I'm seeing. I think it's like all fairly light touch.
You have the last word, and then we break for lunch.
I'll be really quick, I'm standing in the way of us in lunch. No, I think a really interesting session here. I think the point about private valuation is a really important one. We did a project that was looking, interviewing auditors under the New York City bias auditing regime. For those who are familiar, this is a local law New York City passed 2 years ago that basically required anyone using an automated employment decision-making tool to have to undergo a bias audit by an independent auditor once a year. And the idea is this law is set up with fear of change about transparency. If you're applying for a job, you will see in the application if it's using a decision-making tool, and you will see a nice ratio table for helping your data scientists to understand if you might be racially discriminated against. And the law like spectacularly failed. Only 18 companies of the 200,000 employers in New York City actually did an audit and posted it. The other thing that happened was a lot of these tools were biased, but there's no requirement that they not be used. The law doesn't require you to stop using it. But probably the most interesting thing was that it really highlighted how difficult establishing an independent auditing regime that's kind of even something driven by regulatory pressure is. Almost every auditor we talked to described a process of companies just refusing to give them access to the right data, companies making up data, literally just like being like, roughly there's 50% men and women in the world. So like, that's how much we employ, and doing all kinds of things like, distilling someone's race from names, kind of really bad sense practices that, but nonetheless are a way to make something compliant. So I think it's really complex. I think on one hand, you're absolutely right, Grace. I don't think we can rely on private companies to do the kind of societal impact governance that is not a revenue generator or something like cybersecurity that you sell as a asset or something that is like strengthening your position with rivals. But at the same time, if you want to do that kind of government-led intervention that's requiring these kind of several impact evaluations or assessments, it requires like very careful structuring and creation, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of standard making, a lot of guidance, and always comes with the risk that it goes the way of the cookie banner or DPOs, data protection officers, where it just becomes a tick box exercise.
Only thing I will say in one sentence is that private governance does not necessarily mean private for-profit companies. There's a huge spectrum.
Okay, thanks, everybody.